I believe we will take questions now, and I think we're going to, like last time I thought worked well, to take a round of questions, and then we can dish out responses. Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Smriti, and my...
And introduce yourself, which was excellent.
My name is Smriti Rao, and I teach at Assumption University in Worcester. My question is for Chandru. So, you know, when you were describing the DDR, you were using the word austerity. And of course, this made me think, I'm not sure that it has percolated down, you know, that a domestic debt restructuring is in fact austerity. So I'm wondering, and I have no idea if you think this is plausible, that one of the things that's going on is, given that austerity is now a slightly loaded political term, and cutting the health budget and cutting the education budget attracts, is this sort of pushing austerity one level away from public scrutiny and political backlash? So is that another function that this particular move accomplishes? So, yeah.
Hey, thanks so much. My name is Kevin Gallagher from Boston University. Three great presentations. I think let's remind ourselves of the current context we're in right now, where we are in a situation of not just super high interest rates and an incredible amount of debt distress, but we have net inflows of financing going into emerging market and developing countries. But no one's really talked about growth yet. And to me, you know, Shari made great points on how to deal with the debt problem, but the key one is growth. And it's not just about increasing net inflows. We have to make sure that they work for some kind of a structural transformation that is lower carbon, socially inclusive, eradicates poverty, you know, middle income, and deal with climate resilience. And in the reform that agenda at the UN, to what extent are they going to talk about trying to make the international institutions more growth enhancing? You know, there's 20 years of econometric evidence that shows that the IMF is not, you know, IMF programs are not correlated with growth. But what's really alarming now is that the MDBs aren't either. There's a big literature now that showed over the past 5 years that MDB financing is not associated with economic growth. And so net inflows are not enough. They have to be transformative, and not only do they have to be growth enhancing, they have to be a new growth path, right? This is a conference about climate change and development. And so how do we do that? And what's the reform agenda of these institutions? Because we don't really need, you know, we don't necessarily want more money from the IMF and World Bank if it's not going to cause the growth that's going to eventually reduce the debt burdens and get us to this space that we need to get to.
Hi, my name is Pablo Bortz from the University of San Martin in Argentina. I have a question for CP, or perhaps to emphasize more the argument, which comes the day after the domestic debt restructuring. As you mentioned, the domestic debt is supposed to be risk-free, or very low, like the underpinning of the domestic financial system. And that is not something that is taken into consideration when arguing for domestic debt restructuring. What is the consequence for the day after? What is it loses this low risk premium that should enjoy along other domestic assets. So actually it's self-defeating for the day after, because it dampers, it harms the possibility of developing a sustainable, a strong domestic debt market, which is along the three lines: domestic currency, domestic investors, in domestic law. So it is a confluence of these three factors for the day after the debt restructuring. There is no much argument about what happens after the debt restructuring.
Yeah, this is for Chandru. I'm Mark Weisbrot, sorry, Center for Economic and Policy Research. So I was really interested in the part where you were talking about the power of the foreign creditors, and of course the obvious ones are the IMF and the World Bank and them. But you know, I think that one of the most extreme examples was in 2012 when this New York judge ordered that Argentina couldn't pay 90% of its creditors. And And I think that's really determined most of it happened in the last 12 years, because then the only government that had been really successful economically lost, and you had a right-wing government. And then the judge actually said out loud that when Macri was elected, that we'll lift the injunction. And then, of course, I would argue that the events since then were a result of the inflation depreciation spiral that was caused by the $57 billion loan, the largest IMF loan lever that he ever took. So anyway, I'm just wondering if you ran into those kind of problems, not quite that severe, but other places where this trade-off between domestic and foreign debt was looked at through the lens of what the foreign creditors could do for political reasons.
Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac Diwan from the PERI School of Economics and the Finance for Development Lab. Thank you for these very interesting presentations. There's a theme in the three papers which is about domestic external debt default, basically. Richard asked why all countries don't default. We have a choice between domestic and external default, whether we need the system. And somehow this is still confusing, right? It's not conceptualized right somehow. I mean, clearly we are in a situation when default is considered where there are losses that need to be divided, and whether it's the citizen who pays more taxes, who receives less services, the domestic bondholders, the external lender, losses have to be decided somehow. And typically they're allocated according to the political economy, to the IMF rules and desires. There's obviously the fact that capital is more mobile. I mean, obviously it's a threat not to lend again, which does have an impact on, ministers of finance don't like to default externally. So, the question is can we make a difference with some rules to organize all this in some meaningful way? I mean, the IMF has this bizarre two types of rules for poor countries and for countries with market access. For the poor countries, you look at external debt, you bring it down to some, black box level, 30, 40, 50%, depending on something. And then the rest has to be digested domestically, whether it is to capital or to people, to citizens, to labor, depending. And while for the Sri Lankas of this world, it is total debt sustainability, and it's left to bargaining with external and domestic to decide how to allocate that. Interestingly, Chandru, you show us these figures about how many domestic defaults there are. I think ESSE looks at that and shows that domestic debt default takes place when there's a small crisis or a very large crisis. When there is a small crisis, many countries prefer not to have external default, focus on only domestic to absorb the shock. And when it's very large, they divide it between the two. So we need to understand more the political economy of all this. And if we think of rules, it seems to me there's one rule missing, which is to figure out some incompressible service expenditure for services domestically. I mean, of course, we have the SDGs and we have all the international agreements, but they're so generous that they are totally unapplied. And the only rule today when the IMF comes in is I leave 0.5% for social safety net and everything else can go. And that's a little bit extreme, very much extreme. And so somehow to have a rule on this, it seems to me, would be useful. On capital, external versus internal debt, it seems to me it's not easy to have a simple rule. We need to think a little bit more about it, and I'd love to have more of a discussion on this.
Hi, I'm Karina from the University of Leeds. I just wanted to, on the debt, domestic and external discussion, I think something that is kind of underpins the discussion is who holds the debt, because what we've seen in the last decades is that there has been an incremental shift towards domestic debt, even in lower income countries, but also the holdings of the holders sometimes are foreign holders, which means in practice there is an expectation of convertibility, right, to foreign currency, and that will pose also a burden on the balance of payment. So in practice, this is relevant, and also in relation to the previous comment, the IMF, when it analyzes the debt sustainability of lower income countries, it tends to consider the residency of the holders as part of the analysis, as opposed to the essay that applies to middle income. So my question, which is a genuine question, is something I am also thinking about and kind of reflecting upon, is should we have a kind of differential treatment legally in relation to the holders, if the holder is domestic or foreign? Because I do appreciate, as Paulo was mentioning, there is a significant cost in terms of the sustainability of the local capital markets and also the banking system for the country if the holders are domestic holders, especially banks. But also it's true that in some cases, and Zambia is a good, I think, example, at least when the debt crisis started, it's relevant to analyze the fact that in some cases a significant proportion of the debt actually these are foreign holders. So should we have different, perhaps kind of start thinking about different rules when it comes to the restructuring of this debt? Yeah, this is my question. Thank you. You? Okay.
Hello, I have two questions for Shari and one comment on Chandru. The question for Shari, the first one is the following. You mentioned the need to increase investment for structural transformation. If I understood correctly, that sort of goes in line with when Kevin was asking about growth. Now, I know, for example, that in Latin America, the rate of growth of the gross formation of fixed capital is highly correlated, statistically significant with imports. And so when you increase investment, you're increasing imports, and if you don't have corresponding exports, then you have a current account deficit, and therefore you can cover that through more debt. Now, should the international financial architecture also do something about this? That's number one. Number two is the use of GDP to measure, for example, debt, distress, and so on. What I have found out in some empirical studies is that sometimes the real gross national disposable income is a better measure than GDP. Because, for example, in some Central American countries, this measure takes into account remittances and takes into account the effect of the terms of trade. And therefore, if you take, for example, in the case of Central America, the impact of COVID with GDP, for example, for some countries, the contraction was 8%. But when you took into account the gross formation of fixed capital, because it took remittances, and for some countries, the remittances are very high, the contraction was only 4%. And some countries had a positive rate of growth during COVID. And that can change either your risk assessment, the way you view debt, and some other measures of economic performance. And I'd like to know what your point of view on that is. The comment from Chandru is very brief. You mentioned that countries issue bond in the international bond market to cover the balance of payments deficit. I know for a fact, this is from technical assistance, that, for example, in some countries issue international bonds in the international market to pay local debt. And the main creditor of that local debt, sovereign local debt, is the banking system. So you're issuing debt in the international financial system to pay and to prop up the local commercial banking system. Thank you.
Ahilan Kadirgama from the University of Jaffna in Sri Lanka. Like this question of why not default that Richard put up. And in the absence of a debtors club, you lose all bargaining power, right? So in the case of Sri Lanka, what was interesting is on the lead up to the default, all our right-wing think tanks called for default, right? Saying that this is the way forward, but then that was linked to the idea that then we would go to an IMF program and we would stick to the IMF program. This is our 17th IMF program, but it's very different from all the previous 16 because we've defaulted. So then the sort of severe austerity kicks in. And this is what my question to all of you and also to Chandru, that the whole idea of reducing debt stock is, I mean, if you look at the end point of the IMF program, is to go back and float an international sovereign bond 4 years later, right? So you have to reduce the debt stock, including the domestic debt stock, so that it's not just about the immediate debt restructuring process, but what is the end process is to again go back to commercial borrowing. So we get into this trap, right? This cycle of, so even, you know, as Shari says, okay, we reduce debt stock, but towards what end? Again, to then go and borrow again in the commercial markets.
Okay, I know we're way beyond time. Very quickly, this is to Shari and Richard. You know, I was on a board for effective multilateralism where we made some proposals. Two of them relate to the IMF. One of them was about, in fact, a sort of global financial safety net. And the whole idea was that the IMF should do SDR swaps. And in fact, it's perfectly feasible. It doesn't really even require a change in the memorandum of agreement or anything. So just whether you've been thinking of that as a possibility. And the other is to have a sort of automatic issue of SDRs every year linked to the global rate of growth so that, you know, at least share of liquidity to global economy, which we at that time estimated would be about $200 to $250 billion, depending on the kind of expansion, half of which would go to public, to decided climate finance, and the half would result automatically allocated to countries facing shocks beyond their control, like climate shocks, interest rate shocks, or terms of trade shocks. So just wondering whether you've considered those. Yeah.
Thank you for wonderful questions. We're going to turn it over to each of the panelists. I think we'll go in the same order. Oh, no, I think we'll go in this. I propose we go in the same order as the presentations, because you can really use it for an opportunity for a last word. You're certainly welcome to respond. I jotted down what people said if you want to see notes, but I think we'll, if it's okay, we'll go. So let me pass you the microphone, if I may.
Thank you, and they're really, really good questions/comments, because we're in the early stages of thinking through and really looking for inputs and ideas for how to move how to move these discussions forward. So, Kevin, in terms of the growth enhancing, I mean, certainly the development system is supposed to be growth enhancing, or that's the purpose of it, but we all know that it's not. And there are a lot of underlying reasons for that are, I think some of them are being discussed now and some are probably not. You know, one issue is that the MDBs, the incentives are just to get money out the door. They don't even think about measuring impact, or they're thinking about measuring impact now. They're all doing it differently, but it's really just starting now. But then there are questions of what impact are they thinking of, and how do you think about longer term impacts that will take more time versus sort of short term measures that you can look at and check off the box. So I think that, you know, certainly I like the way you articulated it, though, because maybe that's a way to bring into the conversation I mean, again, the question of, but so I think that that's something that we should continue to talk about. How do we better bring that narrative into the conversation, and then specifically what that means underlying that. So to change in that way, what does that mean? But as you know, the MDB evolution roadmap, it's, you know, they stuck to their old, they just added climate to their old goals. They didn't really rethink what the role of the MDB system and what the role of the World Bank should be, and how does they really incorporate the SDGs into this, and growth and things. So I think that that's something maybe that can go into the discussion. The question from Ishak, or comment from Ishak, his question comment, but So I think that, yes, so we're in a sense, you're getting to the question, which also relates to the question, of when does a country call default, or how do you call default? And what is the role of DSAs? Right now, right now, I guess the country calls default, and they have to want to default or be forced to default because they just are going to default. So should there be a set of rules? And then one question would be, how does one change the DSA? I do think that if we, there's also the political economy side of how do we bring those conversations to the IMF and World Bank. So right now there actually are two, as you said, two DSAs run by two different people even. So it's not even the same people who are thinking about the changes and updates to the DSAs, the reforms to it. But maybe this is something also to think about going forward in the debt group, to say part 2, maybe to think about, because we have a debt working group that, that we're happy to have others be part of discussions, and to maybe say that a second layer of that will be to think through some of these issues of what a set of rules could be to help guide countries in thinking this. I mean, the questions of why countries don't default is complicated, and for years everyone's done what is the real cost of default, and other than and that's if the default process was smoother, there would be almost no cost to default, and you would grow afterwards. So the question is, which does get to this question or the comments you made about to what effect? If you reduce the debt stock, then what happens next? And I think that one of the questions is, from our side, the narrative that has been being discussed is that debt is not bad, and that debt is good if it's used well, and if it's invested well, and particularly that's how you grow and get out and continue to grow. And you do need to reduce the debt stock to be able to grow. The question then is, if you go to the markets, what are the terms of the debt you're getting? And is that debt short-term? What is the tenor of it? What is the cost of it? And et cetera. Does the market, how will they judge the credit of the country? And is that realistic? What does that mean? Because it's just a perception of risk. And so I think that's one of the reasons to think through the MDB system, and to ensure that the MDB system can support countries with affordable long-term finance when markets are lending at rates that are not reasonable, in the sense that they're too expensive to lead to growth. They're too expensive to, so then how do we bring in the development bank system for affordable long-term finance and very long-term finance? We're all, we've been and discussions of really having very long-term finance, and in certain cases without payments in the early years, so the payments come much later on, so that the growth can help you repay the debt. The questions from Esteban. Definitely the question of GDP. I think we all know it's not a good indicator of many things, when you think, I guess there's also the question of what are you using it for. So there's the whole discussion of beyond GDP. There's so many areas that GDP is used for, and I think that in terms of, so one is when thinking about debt sustainability, and then I don't know if I would assume the DSAs go beyond that and think about net national. I would assume they do, because they use the whole macro model. I don't know. Right, so they don't, I would have assumed they would. If they don't, then that's one of the things in the discussion of what a DSA should do. How do you think about the entire macro model and not just, but the second issue is, for other aspects, looking at beyond GDP. I think that, as there's a discussion in the UN on both vulnerabilities and how do you look beyond GDP. Unfortunately, the beyond GDP discussion has come down to saying just look at GDP and a couple of other indicators. So instead of looking at the 200 whatever SDG indicators, now it's just saying, well, we're going to just focus on a smaller number of indicators as beyond GDP. That's not really the discussion that everyone thought about when talking about spending real assets. and how that impacts your long-term, what does that mean to your wealth, and how do you bring some and environmental issues, and how do you bring that in to the interlinkages between them are being completely missed. And so that's an unfortunate question that maybe can be, again, it was in Addis to do this, but this is what's come out of it. And it was just because they couldn't be, there was almost no agreement on anything else. I think that's, Jayati, yes, both of those ideas, yes. So, and this automatic or counter-cyclical issuance of SDRs, they were also in the SDG, the Secretary General's policy brief in different wording, but the same type of ideas. And again, the question will be, how does one find a way to politically bring them into an agreement that everyone can agree on? And so how does one, if not, and can you just move them forward, or can you actually get the agreement on the thing itself? And how does one think about it? How does one do that?
Yeah, very quickly. Just on the SDR, I mean, it is quite shocking how turgid the process of recycling has gone. I know, but I mean, that will just tell you the kind of reaction that you can expect from any sort of more bolder proposals around SDR, I think. I mean, that would be the worry. And there's the related worry with the recycling issue, particularly, of converting what is a non-interest bearing asset through the resilience funds or whatever, into a lending mechanism. Yeah. On what? But I mean, if you have a permanent if you have a permanent issue, there'll be no interest charge on that, of course, right? Yeah. I mean, I'm just shocked about how difficult it has been to really make advance on use of the SDR mechanism of the IMF. On the growth story that Kevin raised. I mean, I guess the IMF assumes that its policies are actually growth enhancing, usually extremely exaggerated projections for the growth, which are then constantly revised down. But I mean, there is an assumption, there's a very optimistic assumption about what adjustment programs deliver in terms of growth. Our worry, and I get this a lot from the G20, is the talk now around decarbonization, which is a lot of what is being discussed in the case of the roadmap, is coming at the expense of other important components of the growth story. I mean, this is a particular concern that Brazil has, for example, that decarbonization will come at the expense of their desire to reindustrialize and the growth potential of the kind of structural transformation that you mentioned. I think that's a real concern that developing countries have, that the climate challenge is crowding out some of these more traditional development objectives, and it's something that I think people do need to be very conscious of at the moment. I think that's it. Really.
Oh, very quickly. I think we have passed well into lunchtime. So, yeah. The first, the question about austerity, I think Smriti is the one who raised it. The way in which austerity can be seen as an outcome of domestic debt restructuring is, first, of course, if you actually require, let's say, pension funds to take a haircut, that would essentially mean that there's going to be some kind of a reverse wealth effect, because people suddenly find that the savings that they thought that they accumulated, they don't have anymore because of the fact that there's this restructuring which has happened. And that will work itself back, not merely in terms of future consumption, but in terms of current day consumption, because you'll want to then save up again to try and get to some target level. I mean, if there is a target level you want to get to for your old age, your retirement, etc. The second way, of course, is the banks. That if banks become stressed or face significant liquidity constraints, obviously that will affect credit provision, and that affects consumption and investment, and therefore it will have some kind of an austerity effect indirectly. And finally, of course, the banks go insolvent and you decide, as many developing countries are now speaking of, to have bail-ins as a way of dealing with banking crisis, then you're basically saying that even savings which rest as deposits in the banking system are going to be hurt. So put all of that together and you can have a significant effect in terms of domestic demand, which comes as a result of austerity. And I don't think this is a concealing other forms of austerity, because it's not that you don't do the other thing. You still require countries like Sri Lanka still has to increase electricity charges, user charges, and other kinds of services, reduce subsidies, etc., etc. You do all of that, plus you do, so it's a double dose of austerity rather than using one to conceal the fact of austerity. That I think partly maybe answers the question of what happens after. What happens after is that these are the channels. I don't know if I got your question, otherwise we'll discuss it over lunch. And about the law, the advantage of domestic debt is the sovereign can change the law, whereas the sovereign cannot change New York law, or London law. And therefore, you not only have the situation that you're dealing with a currency which you control through your central bank or directly, but you also have the right to change the laws which operate on your debt instruments. Finally, this question of differential treatment which comes as a result, and whether we should take into account the question of residency. What happens if you have residents who are also foreign bond holders, or foreigners or domestic currency bond holders? I don't know, maybe this is most easily resolved if we actually focus on currency difference. So if there's a resident who holds a foreign currency bond, obviously that resident takes the haircut which possibly can come because you took the risk that this government may not be in a position to be able to generate foreign exchange necessary to meet its foreign currency payments on past debt. So you say that, okay, if you're a resident bondholder or of a foreign currency bond, you take the same haircut. And the other would be true, that depending on how you deal with domestic currency bonds, even if you have a non-resident holder basically decided to take the currency risk by holding a domestic currency bond. That's why it's not so easy to issue domestic currency bonds or whatever, panda bonds or masala bonds or whatever you want to call them in international markets. But otherwise, you treat them the same way. And all I'm trying to say is that you don't treat them by restructuring debt because of the fact that you don't need to restructure debt, so long as you have control over monetary and fiscal policy, as well as you have a certain degree of flexibility with regard to domestic law, which can be altered by the legislature. So it's best to stick to the currency difference rather than the residence difference or the law difference, which kind of a law, what kind of legal jurisdiction you fall under. I think I'll discuss the other questions.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists. Please join me in thanking them. We're a couple of moments over, and lunch will be served in the atrium downstairs. Please, a reminder, please pack out your garbage. We all know it's important to take care of take care of the room.
Yeah.
So please, if you'll be so kind as to take plates or cups with you and drop them in a suitable receptacle. Jayati has a word before we adjourn.
Sorry. I mean, I think you'll all agree it was worth the extra time, right? This session, it was so great. But as a result, could we please have a 45-minute lunch, if you don't mind? So we're back here at 1:15. Thank you. And please remember to take your cups and glasses and plates and stuff. Thank you.